This episode of Shadiversity is brought to you and sponsored by Knights of Pen and Paper No. 2, the critically acclaimed turn-based retro-style, pop culture referencing, satirical, YouTube-sponsoring, humorous, not taking self too seriously, possessor of too many titles, pixel art adventure. But seriously, if you like Dungeons & Dragons or classic fantasy, there's a very high chance that you'll love Knights of Pen and Paper too. The game doesn't take itself too seriously, and in many ways is a complete satire and parody of the classic pen and paper role-playing games that myself and perhaps many of you love playing. You can pick hilarious character classes such as Nerd, Hipster, and Surfer, though it doesn't seem like you can pick the overly enthusiastic YouTube content creator who possesses an unhealthy obsession with swords. Also known as the most powerful character class in existence, which is probably why they didn't include it, because it would be too OP. The game is available for free from the iOS and Android App Store, and if you're on PC, there is a version available on Steam for a very affordable price. So please do go check out Knights of Pen and Paper No. 2 through the affiliate link in the description below.
Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad. And if you haven't watched my video on the problems with super large swords, I encourage you to watch it, because this is kind of a follow-up from that video, because after talking about the problems, here now I want to try and figure out under what circumstances would a really large sword, indeed a giant sword, be useful and practical. There are a couple of big ones that come to mind straight away, and that is the benefits of reach. Okay, if you're able to outreach your opponent and strike them and they're not able to strike you, massive benefit and bonus. Okay, and the other thing is the increased angular momentum that you would get out of this sword when you strike with it. Much greater forces at play there. Now, dependent on the weight of the sword will also affect how much force or energy you're able to produce out of it in a big way, but you can get pretty large swords, indeed giant swords, nowhere near as heavy as what are often depicted as they would be. Previous video, we figure out that Cloud's Buster Sword and Guts's Dragon Slayer Sword around the 100 kilo mark, which is just insane, and the only way to kind of overcome that is if you had a way to anchor yourself in place or had super weight or mass yourself so you wouldn't get thrown off balance whenever you throw it around. But a kind of interesting answer to that is, what if you use that to your advantage? What if when you threw the sword, the fact that the momentum weight of the sword would then pull yourself with it, what if you just went with it and kind of had this interesting acrobatic combative style where the sword is throwing you around as much as you throwing the sword around? And you know, that would actually be really interesting, and it could probably look really, really cool. So you'd have someone with a super large sword and they do this big swing hit and then they kind of jump with it and they end up doing this flip thingy and they land and they kind of redirect the momentum, and the thing that you'd have to do with it, you'd have to go with the movement. Trying to stop that sword in motion is when you don't have the mass or the ability to anchor yourself to do that, okay? The only time you would ever want this sword to stop in its motion is when it's hitting something like a wall or the ground or something like that, where all that energy is being transferred into the target and not yourself just trying to stop it once it's, you know, being jerked forward from your own ability to accelerate this massive amount of weight. Gee, it would be difficult to use, but hey, fiction, fantasy. And the thing is, it would be extremely dangerous. Like if someone accidentally moved into the way of you moving the sword, the problem is you can't stop the sword's motion. That's the problem, okay? Unless you have something to anchor yourself in place, regardless of how super strong you are, and if you don't have super weight, all right, this sword's momentum, once you accelerate it, is going to pull you with it. And so someone walks in the way of your sword strike, sorry, they're dead. You can't stop the sword. But that is something to consider, okay? You know, just go with the weight. Can you work it with your advantage? Is there another way you can try and figure out? One, okay, get the weight down. And in my video, I mentioned 20 kilos would be about the appropriate weight, but I'm thinking now between 10 and 20. 10 is easily enough. And then if you make the sword really, really long, like, you know, my great sword that I show in the video, well, one of the interesting questions in this discussion is, why do you need to make the blade so thick? Okay, the real only part of the sword blade that's doing anything is the cutting edge. So you can take a sword that's really, really massive and big and just shrink it down. I mean, great sword blades, there's a reason why they're so thin. They don't need to be so thick. When you make them thick, you're just adding weight. That's the thing. Weight can be a massive advantage if you're wanting to increase the power and force behind the sword. But still, look at Cloud's Buster Sword. Essentially, if you're just relying on its cutting ability and not its weight to do massive amounts of force in structure, in strikes and things, And especially if the edge was enhanced by some fantasy, futuristic technology or whatever, in which it can cut through anything, it doesn't need all this mass behind it. You can cut away most of the mass of that sword, and its cutting potential could be just as great, as good as it was before. So giant swords actually don't need to be nearly as wide as they are depicted. What would be the appropriate width for a sword like this? Well, that's kind of tricky, because when a sword becomes longer, all right, there's more weight on its further end, which means more stress on the whole blade, overall. And so when you strike with the sword, and say if you're able to stop it, all right, you throw the sword forward and you're able to stop it, if the sword's own structural strength isn't strong enough, great enough, meaning if it isn't thick enough or even wide enough, there's a chance the blade would just bend like that. In fact, I have done this. I made a sword out of a bit of bracing steel. Okay, so when you make a timber frame home, there's these bracing straps that they put on the thing, and I made when I was a kid a sword out of this bracing steel, and I made the blade really, really long. And so I thought this was really cool. I fixed the handles with it, and I did this big cut, and I stopped it, and the blade, when I stopped, did this. And it bent, just like that. Because the structural strength of the blade wasn't nearly great enough to support its own weight when in motion, and especially on the stresses that come into it when you're trying to throw its inertia or stop its inertia, stuff like that. And so if you have this sword that's like, 2 meters long or 7 foot, if it's too thin, that could be a serious problem. And look, this is if, say, it was built out of something comparable to steel, but you'd probably even want something lighter than steel but stronger, and fantasy, future, you got all those fantasy materials. Still, a blade width of, say, maybe, this wide for the blade. Just in a casual analysis on what, I kind of get an understanding from the strength of materials and also structural strength that comes from the internal geometry of sword design. Yeah, so for a sword, 2 meters long, I'd think a blade width of maybe, that's 14 centimeters to 15? How useful would a sword be if it was that long? And it's funny, I find people often quoting Kenshin Himura from great anime, by the way, Rurouni Kenshin, one of my favorite. But when Kenshin is fighting one of the characters that will later become a mainstay in the whole series, his opponent is using a Zanbato, as they call it, and it's basically the equivalent of Guts' Dragon Slayer, essentially. And Zanza, he calls himself Zanza early on, is getting frustrated that he can't hit Kenshin, and Kenshin says, well, there's a reason why you can't hit me, because with such a large sword, you can only attack horizontally and vertically.
Zanza, the Zanbato is a rather limited weapon. Due to its weight and size, you must either swing it down or to the side, only 2 choices, which makes it extremely easy to predict.
It's interesting how often I hear people echoing that same sentiment, and sometimes they credit coming from Kenshin and others they don't, but it really sounds like they are, saying, obviously that sword is impractical. I disagree. If this super large sword, you had super strength, was at a comparable weight where you could still redirect it around in the same level of mobility that a regular person can with a regular sword, even having a really, really long blade, you would still be able to perform a great variety of sword maneuvers with a very large level of maneuverability. And even regarding downward strikes, you wouldn't be able to do a perfectly, horizontal upwards cut, but you could do ones at an angle because you can put the sword down at a downwards angle to yourself, like this, not at a perfectly horizontal downwards angle, but just at a downwards angle, and still have it not hit the ground and be able to do upward strikes in that fashion. No, your ability to maneuver the sword in unpredictable and also complex kind of techniques in sword fighting would be very, very high, and it's a misconception to think that it's so unwieldy that you wouldn't be able to do it. It would be unwieldy if you didn't have the strength or weight to offset the sword's momentum, but if you did have that, the sword, even though really long, would be very useful. A much more logical situation that would affect the person's ability to use a really, really long sword is if you were in a confined environment, like in a room or a hallway or something like that, and you didn't have the room to swing around the sword. That would be a problem. But if you had an open enough space to do it, yeah, absolutely. So with this giant sword, if you're fighting any other human-sized opponent with a regular-sized weapon, you would have a massive advantage over them if you had enough room to swing it around. The other massive advantage about swords, which is why a really, really large sword could be quite useful if you had the ability to use it or able to make a sword that you could use that was so large. When I say that, I'm referring to weight because there's another caveat that I'll talk about a bit later in regards to energy weapons. But I don't want to talk about the energy weapons just yet because they would still benefit from this thing I'm talking about, and it's their striking range, okay? One of the biggest advantages about swords over other weapons is that most of the sword you can offend your opponent with, meaning do damage to them. An axe, the striking range on an axe, very, very small, but on a sword, it's the entire length of the blade. And if you had a very, very long blade, well, you just have a very, very larger striking area. So not only would you be able to strike at people at a much greater distance to yourself, but you could also do much, much wider cuts, and your risk in missing the opponent from them getting in too close or even getting too far away is far less because there's so much area on the blade that you can cut with. And this comes to the next big circumstance in which a really large sword could be useful and appropriate. And that's if you're fighting things of a very large size and you need to do very large cuts. Of course, alright, if you didn't have superpowers and stuff like that and you're fighting something of massive size to yourself, reality is it would kill you, okay? Fighting a dragon, fighting something of elephant size, any type of monster like that, like an ogre or things like that, if they're larger than you and they have the, proportionate strength to their size, you're probably going to die, and you'd want to keep as much distance to yourself as possible, and that's where maybe a pike and stuff like that would be as useful. But if you had a sword as long as a pike, maybe, and if you had the superpowers to go with it, well then a really large sword could be really appropriate, because a sword has much greater damage potential than a pike. The pike, you can only, hurt it with the tip, okay? And if the creature gets close and past the tip, you can't, hitting it with the shaft isn't going to do squat. But a sword, aha! And if the sword could do really big cuts and you could swing it around, yes, super large swords become far more logical when you're fighting particularly large opponents. And now we'll talk a little bit about the energy sword kind of thing, because that does seem to answer a lot of the issues. If you're getting the most of the effect from the sword from its cutting ability and not its concussive damage or force, you don't need it to be too wide or have any significant mass. And energy swords, like a really big lightsaber, and people have brought up Brandon Sanderson's shard blades, they're actually a pretty good example. It's funny, Brandon Sanderson actually really likes super large swords as well, and so he wanted to create a setting in which super large swords would be functional and useful, and that's the whole reason behind the chasm fiends being so big in his books, as well as the type of monsters that the Knights Radiant fight as well. That's the logic behind the shard blades being so large, and yeah, I agree, that's the circumstances in which a really large sword is useful and logical. So it's good to see other people thinking about this stuff as well. And with a sword being made out of energy, that solves the problem of the weight almost exactly, as energy doesn't have too much mass to it. Now, it is said in the Stormlight archives that shard blades do have some measure of weight to them, but they're nowhere near as heavy as what a steel sword of the same size would be. So yes, energy swords answers a lot of the issues. You can just have a super large size energy sword or a fictional material that's extremely light, and if you're still fighting the really, really big things, because this is the thing, with fictional materials that are extremely light, generally they will have some other supernatural property that enhances their cutting ability, whether it's a magic edge that enables it to cut really much, or some type of scientific mumbo jumbo that tells the blade can cut through whatever. That means most of the cutting ability is coming from either a magical or scientific source and not the actual mass and force behind the blade, so you don't need the blade to be very heavy. Fictional material, you just need the length to get the reach and also cutting ratio to chop up giant robots or giant monsters. So clearly, just having a massively sized 100-kilo steel sword isn't going to do the job for you if a person using it only has super strength, but if you switch up the parameters a bit in the ways that we've talked about in this video, you can get your cake and eat it too. And I guess getting the cake in this scenario would be you get your super giant sword, and eating it means you could still use it in a functional, logical way that makes sense in your setting. And then giant swords, whether corporeal or incorporeal, or mostly incorporeal, energy, become very useful and functional, and you can put them in your fantasies and stuff like that if you think about the situation logically. And that's it for this video, guys. I do appreciate you watching. I hope to see you again, and until that time, farewell.